2, 1. We're live.
Welcome to this next session where we are honoring our winner of the Smith-Pettit Award for Outstanding Contribution to Mormon Letters, Stephen Carter. So we're very thankful to be joined by Stephen and by Angela Halstrom, who will be interviewing him today, talking about his ideas, his career, whatever interesting things they decide to talk about over the next hour. So this is an annual award that we give that's funded by the Smith-Pettit Foundation for somebody who has made outstanding contributions in the field, and also that we hope to make continuing outstanding contributions in the field. The Lifetime Award tends to be for a more senior author or scholar, and this one is kind of more of a mid-career award, so that we're hoping to encourage more great things from this person in the future. There's going to be an award citation that will be posted on the AML website within about a week or so. But let me read from just a little bit of it and give a summary, because it's kind of long. But let me just give you a brief summary. In a prolific career spanning 25 years so far, Stephen Carter has proven himself as a literally versatile author, committed to exploring his Mormon heritage, one of our leading cultural commentators, and a generous editor who has played an invaluable service in getting a wide variety of great writing on Mormon subjects to publication. Stephen has spent his career writing about himself and others on the edge of LDS society, expressing the richness of spiritual inheritance and the bonds of community, but also expressing both the heartache and the humor of a questioner in a realm where we can only see through a glass darkly. So it goes on to talk about his time as an assistant to Eugene England, when they were starting the first Mormon Studies program at Utah Valley University. Some of his early essays, like Weight of the Priesthood and The Calling, which won awards like the Best American Spiritual Writing 2006. His book-length collection, What of the Night, published in 2010, book of essays. Also his work as getting a PhD at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in cross-cultural education. His time at The Sugar Beat, that he helped create, a satirical Mormon news outlet that a lot of people really enjoyed, that had where he wrote lots of fun articles, like The Onion. So it was anonymous, but we know that he wrote things like Painter Greg Olson enters his blue period and Provo Temple liftoff successful. And then since 2008, he has been director of publications for the Sunstone Education Foundation, which includes editing Sunstone magazine, where he's continued the tradition of great editor essayists who have helmed that magazine, and also injecting more levity into the magazine than I think we'd ever seen before. And in recent years, he has worked diligently to restructure Sunstone and its move into the digital age, including moving his essay writing into podcasts. He has co-written 3 books with the wonderful comics artist Jet Atwood that include the entertaining and informative Mormonism for Beginners, and 2 books in the iPlate series, 2012-2014, graphic novel adaptations of the Book of Mormon, specifically the Mosiah chapters, which are wonderful stories and very funny. I mean, I know my kids loved them very much, and there's a lot to say about those. He's done several, I want to see more pieces of speculative fiction in the 2010s, including the young adult horror novel, The Hand of Glory, and some very imaginative and chilling short stories in that period. He edited the anthology Moth and Rust, Mormon Encounters with Death in 2017, a collection of 46 pieces in a wide variety of genres, including narrative essays, poetry, short fiction, theater, and visual arts, that won an AML award. And his most recent book is Virginia Sorensen, Pioneering Mormon Author, which came out just a month ago. Biography and critical analysis of the writings of one of the great Mormon authors of the 20th century. And where he argues that these novels from the 40s to the 1960s can speak with meaning and healing power to both believing Mormons and post-Mormons today. There's so much to talk about. So I'll turn the time over to Angela, who's got quite a few questions in her back pocket to ask Stephen. Angela, go ahead.
Great. Well, I just have to say, first of all, that I am thrilled to be able to spend this time talking to Stephen. I have been a fan of Stephen's for a long time. I have a stack of his books right here that I have really enjoyed referring to again over the past little while before I knew that I was going to be doing this interview. And that I just have so much respect for Stephen as a writer and as a thinker and as an editor, and think that he has contributed in so many valuable ways to this community. So let's start, Stephen, finding out a little bit about where you began as a writer. So when would you say that you started writing in earnest?
I'd say that I started writing kind of by pure luck. So I had this girlfriend in high school, and we were going into our senior year, and she was taking AP English, and she was reading Young Goodman Brown for class the next day. And I was nibbling on her ear, and I started reading over her shoulder. And after a few lines, I realized that she was reading a story about a witch's Sabbath. And I was like, why do you get to read the cool stuff? So the next day, she asked the AP English teacher if I could join the class. And strangely enough, he agreed, despite my very middling grades, and despite my having not taken the entrance exam. His name was Mr. Olson, a legendary teacher. He had taken up the guitar a few years earlier and played Bob Dylan songs for us to interpret at the beginning of class. Anyway, I loved the class, and not just because my girlfriend's ear was so close by. I realized that English was cool. So then the AP test came around, and I'd been sweating about it because I'd never considered myself the AP type. But then I opened up the test booklet, and it turned out that the poem we were supposed to interpret was by my great aunt, May Sorensen, and that I already knew it inside and out, and I knew the history behind it, and I got a 5 on the test from pure luck. Or maybe it was cheating, I don't know. And I kind of thought, hey, this writing thing's easy. And there's probably lots of money in it too.
So much money.
So then I went on my mission to Toronto, and I was a very good correspondent. I was writing every week to my family and to my girlfriend, without my mission president's knowledge, by the way. He had no idea I had a girlfriend until the last day of my mission. And that was the second biggest reaction I got out of him. The first biggest was when I went to a mission reunion, and he said, "So, Elder Carter, what do you do for work now?" And I said, "Sunstone?"
I love that.
So I think I was the first of the grandkids to go on a mission. So I was a novelty, and my mom typed out all my letters, my girlfriend being the Urim and Thummim for my horrible handwriting, and she sent them out to all the people she thought could possibly be interesting, who would be interested. So, of course, I had to be interesting, and people claimed to enjoy them. And my mom, bless her heart, filed them all away in these big white binders with pictures of me on them, and it was really nice of her, and I have them all in a safe place. And I've never read them. And I probably never will. But of course, now that I've won an AML award, someone's going to have to write my biography. So I'll just let them do
it. So it sounds to me like you owe your career to a bunch of different women, from your girlfriend to your aunt to your mom.
Uh-huh.
I like that. Okay, so what about writing more professionally? When did that start?
Okay. Again, I would say that it started as pure luck. So a few months after my mission, my girlfriend married me. Yay! And a few days afterward, I got a call from the media center at what was then Utah Valley State College. I had applied for a job there as a television pusher. What this means is that I pushed a television VCR combo around on carts to rooms where teachers had ordered them. So I had been working as an alarm installer, so I told the person who called me that I already had a job. And then I sort of stared at the ceiling for 5 minutes and called him back and scheduled an interview. And I got the job, and it was a great job because, I'd run around campus for 15 minutes each hour between classes, but then I had 45 minutes to kill. So I applied for the news editor job at the college newspaper. They were so excited to hire me because I was the only one who applied. And it was a summer term and nobody was there. So I wrote my first article and the editor-in-chief came down and taught me. He looked at my article, he's like, what is this crap? And he taught me how to use the inverted pyramid scheme. And it was then when I first realized, oh, there's a craft to writing. It's something you can actually learn. And that was probably the most important realization of my career. So anyway, I was often sitting at my desk in the media center writing articles on my desk, on my computer. And this guy who had just been put in charge of the distance education department was constantly walking by my desk. And one time he stopped and he said, what do you even do here? I said, well, I push TVs around. He says, no, I mean, I walk by you multiple times a day and you're just sitting there looking at your computer. What are you doing, surfing the web? I said, no, I'm writing. And he said, oh, well, we're going to start this new thing where we put college courses on the internet. Do you want to write some? This is how old I am, okay? So that's how my wife and I started writing classes on accounting, aviation, building inspection technology. That was an interesting one. And Edgar Allan Poe. So the managing editor at the college paper that I got a job at a real newspaper. This was back when news was printed on paper. I don't know if people remember that, but it was called the Provo Sun. And she gave me and my wife jobs there. And that's where I learned about the ravenous world of the press. And then I got a job at the Orem Daily Journal, which, as you might infer from the title, was a daily newspaper. So now I was writing at least 3 articles a day. I covered Provo politics in the Utah Valley State College. That was a nutty time of my life because I worked 3 jobs: the newspaper, UVSC's online education, writing the internet courses, and I was working at UVSC's Center for the Study of Ethics, where I was an administrative assistant. And I had 2 kids. So I was run absolutely ragged. But hey, you know, I was in my early 20s. I had energy. I had my looks. And I've only lost one of those since then.
Well, it seems to me like even though Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours thing has been kind of debunked, but there is a kernel of truth underneath that if you can get yourself into a situation when you're young and just start practicing something, that you were practicing writing every single day for hours and hours and hours, for pay and not for pay.
Yeah, and I was pretty lucky that it was mostly for pay. That doesn't happen a lot anymore.
No. Do you feel like that time was instrumental into your developing an identity as a writer, being able to say, I am a writer?
Yeah, and one of the things that it absolutely did was making writing not so sexy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, something that you can learn, right?
Yeah. It took sort of the mysticism out of it. And also, you know, I had to grind out 1,500 words a day, every day. And I had to go out and find the stories and write them. And I had to go and talk with the professors, figure out what they needed to do, write it. And so writing was work. Yeah. And so once it crossed that threshold, I didn't need to be inspired anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have it demystified early, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I was meeting a lot of people in my MFA course who were like, there's this ritual that I need to go through in order to start writing. And it takes 3 hours. I'm like, oh boy, I don't have that kind of time.
All right, well, tell me then what led you to decide to go to graduate school for writing?
All right, graduate school. So even though I was working myself to death, and even though my wife was doing what she could to bring in the extra money, you know, writing those courses, we just couldn't meet our mortgage, which we never should have taken on. Don't take on a mortgage early in life. we looked into our future and we saw that we had to get some more education so we could get better jobs. I have no idea why we thought creative writing in Alaska was the way to go. I mean, it had no lucrative endpoint, but that's what we did. And it turned out to be the best 5 years of my life because the best 2 years had already been taken, right?
Yeah.
So I took screenwriting for one of my very first classes. And I was a little disappointed that it was being taught by a documentary filmmaker. I mean, what do documentary filmmakers know about screenwriting? I thought. I mean, they just film reality and then they edit it, right? So as it turns out, this was the most important class that I took because it taught me, as did my editor at the College Times, that narrative structure is a craft that can be learned. And this was a godsend for me because I had zero idea how to structure a story, which was weird because, you know, I was a voracious reader, but somehow narrative structure had just never penetrated my head. So I read all the narrative studies books I could get my hands on, though I will admit that Robert McKee's book, the one with the long title, Story, Substance, Structure, Style, and the Principles of Screenwriting, well, that was my Bible. I read it over and over again for 5 years, and I watched so many movies analyzing their structure. It's actually kind of embarrassing how long it took me to figure it out, especially when my, fellow MFA students were saying, Carter, don't you know that structure is dead? And there are all these people around me who just intuited what structure was, and I couldn't do that. I had to learn it.
There were people in your, I guarantee you there were people in your MFA program who were not intuiting structure at all, though.
They just weren't willing to admit it.
Writing whatever came into their head. So
that did happen a lot. But there was definitely an anti-structure strain in my particular program. I don't know what it was like everywhere else.
Yeah, I had the same thing.
Did you? But that was what I focused on.
Yeah, so continue talking about the direction that you went then.
Okay. So I started watching a lot of movies because they're, very short stories that have an entire arc. It was very useful. And so eventually I could write, I could read it. I could watch a movie, or I could write or read a novel, and I could start seeing its structure in my head like a blueprint. And when I could do that, I finally realized that taking a screenwriting class from a documentary filmmaker was the perfect way to do it. They have to be so good at narrative structure that they can pull it out of the chaos of reality. And the interesting thing was, I actually got a chance to do that because I got hired onto a grant that was working with first-year teachers in rural Alaska. So these are people who have just graduated from college, and their first teaching job is in the bush with an indigenous culture. And I found out about this newly married Mormon couple from Seattle who were coming up to take their first teaching job in Shishmaref, which is this tiny sandbar island on the west coast of the Seward Peninsula. So I called them and I said, can I follow you around with a camera for your first year? And they said, yes. And it was fascinating watching them. And then I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the stories of first-year teachers in Alaska and what they told about their experience. And I went from like the 1800s to 2005. And eventually I edited together 100 hours, I think it was 126 hours of footage into a movie, a little documentary about this couple, which you can watch on YouTube. It's called Bushed, Teaching Life in Alaska.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that little fact about your career. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was wild just going up into the tundra and seeing these people trying to make their lives there. But of course, since I was in these indigenous communities, I also got to learn about indigenous ways of storytelling, which are completely different in many ways from Western methods. So that blew my brain apart. And so none of this would have happened if we hadn't have gone to Alaska. So again, it was a lot about luck. But then, since this is a Mormon thing, I'll talk about the spiritual stuff too. So on the spiritual side, in the months before we left for Alaska, I had this dream that we had arrived in Alaska and that it was beautiful. The light was golden, the landscape was lush, and there was this feeling of wide openness. But then the sun set and it became completely dark, and I became terrified, and I dropped my hands in my knees and was just trying to feel my way around. But I had no idea where I was. I was in a completely new place. I didn't know where I was going. And that's kind of what happened to me. I had enrolled in the fiction program, but whenever I sat down to write, all I could write about was Mormonism. It was as if, getting 2,000 miles away from Utah into a totally new landscape with this extreme climate had snapped all of the stabilizing connections I had. And I was trying to figure out what life meant. The first thing I wrote was just these memories of a fishing trip with my Cub Scout troop. But then I started writing about how the priesthood had affected my life and about what had happened when my great Aunt May left Utah to pursue her poetry. And while I was writing these things, there was one part of me that wanted my stories to be faith affirming. Mm-hmm. And there was another part of me that wanted exactly the opposite. And the thing was, both were really tempting. I'd never felt this before. And I haven't found myself bouncing back and forth between them while I was writing. And this wasn't just a narrative exercise. I wasn't just trying to write something that would get published. I was trying to figure out what my life meant, what eternity meant, what everything I'd ever believed meant. And as the Alaskan darkness set in, a dark night of my soul was setting in too, and it terrified me. Mm-hmm. My dreams seemed to be coming true, and I wanted more than anything to escape. And that was when I remembered Eugene England. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit earlier about how I worked for him as his assistant. So I was working in the Center for the Study of Ethics. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, Eugene England, one of the granddaddies of Mormon literature, and also a founding member of the AML, mm-hmm. He was shuffled out of the English department and into the Ethics Center. I don't know why. And he was driving Melanie crazy. She was the executive assistant. And Elaine Engelhardt, another important mentor who taught me philosophy, she said, "Stephen, will you please be Gene's assistant before Melanie quits on us?" And so suddenly he was driving me crazy. I'm kidding, sort of.
Yeah, well, I'm curious as to why you would say that. Like, what was it like to work for you?
It's a good question. First thing, he was the world's kindest man. He could give Mr. Rogers a run for his money, but he would call me every 5 minutes. And I'd look over at Melanie and she'd smile at me. But he had a ton to do. He had just been given a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to start a Mormon Studies program at UVSC. So he was bringing in scholars and putting on symposiums and starting classes. And of course, there was a ton of busy work to do. And he was constantly calling me and telling me what it is that I needed to do next. And I was going, ah. But I got to meet some amazing people mm-hmm. Through this, like Armand Moss, mm-hmm. Wayne Booth, mm-hmm. and even a young Michael Austin.
Really?
Yeah, which proved fateful, to tell you the truth. But it was one moment in his office that really changed the course of my life. We were just shooting the breeze, and he was reminiscing, and then he grew sad and thoughtful. And he said something along the lines of, "You can't imagine how difficult it was hearing the things I heard from men that I believe are called of God. And that was kind of the first time that he had talked with me about the things, the events that had sort of forced his retirement from BYU. And as he talked, I could tell that he was still really struggling with the pain that those events had caused. I mean, they'd only been like a year or two in the past. It was a tension that he obviously wanted to be relieved of. But the thing was, as I watched him, I didn't see him trying to escape that tension. I didn't see him rendering judgments on the general authorities or, the faculty members or any of the people that he had clashed with. And I also didn't see him trying to justify himself. Instead, I just saw him sit there dwelling in this tension and trying to understand it. And I'd never seen anything like that before. And it stuck with me. So starting then, I was sort of training to dwell in painful tension the same way that Gene did. And that was kind of the basis of pretty much all of my writing since. So to get back to what I was thinking as I was trying to write and constantly being sidetracked by this stuff, as I was trying to navigate these two rivers, these two currents, trying to figure out what was real, who I was, and my dreams starting to become true, that's when I remembered Gene. And I said, okay, instead of choosing one or the other, I need to stay in the tension. And then in the midst of the dark night, the dark, long night of the Alaskan soul, I saw the Aurora. Have you ever seen it? You lived in Minnesota.
But only in northern Minnesota are you going to see it. I never saw it in the Twin Cities.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so I was like up on the Arctic Circle, and it's the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen in my life. And I live and I go to southern Utah. That's how amazing it is. It's like the sky has muscles. It's like horses are racing across the sky. It's actually the most persuasive argument for God's existence that I've come across. But of course, you can only see the Aurora in the darkness, in the deep cold. And to me, that's the reason you need to stay in the tension, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful, even when you feel like your whole world is imploding, because you'll see something that you never expected to see. So that's how I started writing personal essays. All of them were about Mormonism. None of them are easy. None of them answered my questions. They simply kept me in the tension until I saw something new.
Can I
new
mention,
for me anyway? Yeah, go
can I
ahead.
mention one of your essays that I think does an excellent job at being in that tension? Smoke and Mirrors.
Oh yeah.
So, I don't know if you've even thought about that essay in a while, but I think you wrote it back in maybe 2006, 2007. But when I taught creative writing for BYU for a few years, I would teach that essay.
You did?
Mhm.
Wow.
I did.
I didn't know that.
And one of the reasons that I taught it is because I thought, so just to encapsulate it a little bit, you're writing about your brother. And you write about some temple experiences, and you write about how your brother is not able to come into the temple with the rest of your family, and your desire to stay outside with him in the car while he smokes a cigarette. And should you stay with him in the car, or should you follow the rest of your family into the temple. And it ends with this image of you deciding to go back into the temple, but bringing the cigarette smoke from that time in the car with your brother with you. And there's charity for everyone in that story and for yourself. And I love how it shows you trying to figure out, again, it's those contraries that are both there. How can I be in two places at the same time? That I thought was so powerful. And we would always have great class discussions when we would discuss that essay.
Wow. I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life. I had no idea. I was taught at BYU.
Yeah.
This is great.
Yes. So I think you do a masterful job with being able to inhabit those liminal spaces. You really are a master at that. So
The interesting thing is something very similar happened about 5 years ago, except at this time, most of my family stayed outside the temple while a sister got married. And it was just me and another brother who went in.
mm-hmm.
And I wrote one about that too, called Three Ceilings.
I hope you thought about that. Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's in dialogue. You can find it there.
Okay, I will look it up. I probably won't ever teach at BYU again, but if I did, I would have to do both of them side by side.
It would be interesting.
Those who are now, I know Darlene Young and a few others sometimes teach Mormon Lit and creative writing. I think that's the kind of literature we need to be reading.
Those are some lucky students to have Darlene.
I know, they really, really are. Okay, so you got your PhD. When did you get your PhD? What year?
2006.
2006.
2008.
2008.
No, 2006. Okay.
Okay, there you go. Because I think you came back to Utah right about that time.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And I had been living in Minnesota and we moved back to Utah also in 2006. And that's when you and I met, because we were both kind of jumping into the Association for Mormon Letters world,
That's right.
the Mormon Lit world right around that same time. So tell me what happened once you came back to Utah.
Okay. So when I came back to Utah, I didn't actually come back to Utah. I came back to Wyoming.
Oh, yes, I remember this.
That's actually, despite the fact that I lived in Alaska, that's the period I call my season in the wilderness. Because my goal when I got my PhD was to become a college professor. And I really wanted that, but it didn't happen. And I shouldn't feel bad about that because it just doesn't happen. So anyway, my wife and I started teaching school in Wyoming. I taught high school English and she taught fourth grade. So it was actually kind of a crummy time for me at the beginning because my story of my life was gone. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know if I wanted to die in Wyoming. So I met my students and they had zero interest in Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, or, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And they were also bigger and stronger than I was. So I had to learn to survive. I was lucky in that this is bizarre. I only had 3 classes I had to teach and none of them had more than 12 students in it. Wow. So all you Utah teachers,
how can I sign up for
that? Wyoming. It's an amazing place. So anyway, I had time to prepare and I prepared out the wazoo. I thought about these students and I thought, what would make them interested in literature? And so I put together pretty much a new curriculum that still addressed the standards. And I started with cartoons so that I could lure them in. I took some lessons from Satan. You put a little web around them and start leading them, right? So I started leading them down the path of literature. And I even showed them an episode of Michael Moore's television show, The Awful Truth, which just shocked them, but provided plenty of fodder for us to talk about rhetoric. So anyway, this was really important to me because I had an audience who did not give a fig about my subject, and I had to figure out how to see them and how to get to them. They were a baptism by fire, and the tools that I forged there with them were absolutely important to what I've been doing since, because I need to see my audience. So actually, when I got offered the editorship of Sunstone, I struggled over whether I would accept it because I started liking to teach. But we all know how that story ends. And I should really thank my friend Lisa Torcaso Downing for persuading me to take the job. And I hope that I've lived up to her expectations.
I didn't know that was Lisa who'd encouraged you to do that.
She was. She talked me through it.
Wow. Yeah, Lisa's great.
I love Lisa.
She's one of the best. So tell me a little bit about your time in Sunstone. Well, you're still working for Sunstone, but
I'm still here. They haven't fired me yet.
Yeah.
I feel so lucky. And in some ways, that is the least interesting part of my life story. Because most of it involves me sitting in front of a computer, moving words around, trying to make them better. But it's a job that I take very seriously. And I think maybe that makes me a bit overbearing sometimes. I know that I've alienated a few people. I feel really bad about that. But one of the most important things that I learned from my failures was kind of how to get the author ready for my edit. Especially if I'd suggested a lot, how to write the email to kind of take an assets-based approach, right?
yep.
So I always become very deeply invested in making sure that the article or the story or the essay or the poem or whatever was not only as good as it could be, but also seeing if we could get it to take one more step forward. Because to me, that's the purpose of Sunstone. It's to push the conversation forward. So I'd read all the back issues of Sunstone. I was very familiar with Dialogue and Exponent 2 and what they published. And I didn't want the conversation to just circle around. I wanted us to find something new together.
Yes.
Because to me, that's the essence of Mormonism. It's to push into new territory, to have new visions. And there were always seeds of that in what people were sending me, new ideas, and I wanted to help those grow. So the last 15 years has just been me sort of plugging away, adding to the corpus of Mormon discourse, article by article, story by story, poem by poem, and even art piece by art piece, because I'm kind of the art director as well. And I go out and try to find interesting Mormon artists who are doing and saying new things and getting them in there. So mostly what I feel about when I look back on my time at Sunstone is just plain old gratitude. It's been a stroke of amazing luck to be in this position where I can see so many new ideas getting born. All of these wonderful people who want to contribute to Mormon thought and question it and diversify it, and often writing for free. God bless them. Expanding our vision, kind of in the way that Joseph Smith said, taking us as high as the utmost heavens and down also into the darkest abysses. Both are essential.
Well, and I think sometimes people do not understand the value of a great editor. And the fact that you have been there consistently over the past 15 years at Sunstone as such an engaged, thoughtful editor, it's huge. And just kind of like the orchestra in the pit at a musical. You see the performers on the stage and you don't know all the work that went into the orchestra. I think of excellent editors in that same way. It's so much work and it's a real skill. And you are one of the best. So
thank you.
I think that is a really important part of your career trajectory, and your contribution to Mormon Letters is all the facilitating you've done, all the work you've done to help other people's work really shine. It's really, really important. So, okay, so let's talk then a little bit about we don't have a ton of time left. You could talk
Yeah.
a little bit about narrative theory if you want, or you can talk a little bit about some of your projects, your books, essays, or you could weave them both in. So what would you like to talk about?
Okay. I do want to talk about narrative theory.
I thought you might.
I kind of put some work into that. So in grad school, I learned, as we talked about, the principles of narrative, and I put all my effort into learning how to write a good story, how to analyze one, how to spot a good story in the wild. And that's kind of where I thought I'd stay, just learning to understand story structure better and better. But then I came across a novel by fantasy author Terry Pratchett. And in his introduction, he claims, I'm going to read this, it's too good. Stories etch grooves deep enough for people to follow in the same way water follows certain paths down a mountainside. And every time fresh actors tread the path of the story, the groove runs deeper. Or if you prefer, think of it like this. Stories are parasitical life form, warping lives in the service only of the story itself. Unquote. So this is a long way of saying people don't tell stories. Stories tell people. And I've become more and more convinced of that. Not that stories are actual beings, but that people perceive reality and create their identities through stories that already exist. And I haven't been able to decide if that's really cool or abjectly terrifying. So of course, I've been sitting in the tension between the two. So what narrative theory has done, which I think is essential to what I've been doing, is it's helped me, knowing this, to be able to step back from any question and be able to look at it. Because every question is based on a story about what reality is or who you are. And when you can see that story, you can also see what it presupposes, how it functions, and how it interacts with the stories around it, and finally, its real-world consequences. But the thing is, the only way to be able to see a story productively is to look at it non-judgmentally. You have to watch what it does without deciding if what it's doing is right or wrong. Because once you judge something, that's when you stop seeing it. You can only see after that what reasons why you're right. So in other words, a story takes you over. So some of my friends accuse me of being a guy with a hammer who thinks everything is a nail. I walk around thinking that everything is a story, and they're right, but I think I'm right too. So the one thing to note is that I don't necessarily think that it's bad to be told by a story. Sometimes I actually think it's the most beautiful and meaningful thing that can happen to you at a given point. I mean, that's what ritual is, right? And so I also know what it's like to look back and see how a path that a story took me down, how it made me hurt people around me. They've done that to me too. And I also know what it's like to be taken out of a story that I love and watching it disappear and feeling utterly bereft. So to me, narrative theory isn't just theory. This is life. This is doing things that actually can affect the quality of life and the quality of spirituality and the quality of meaning. So to me, narrative is the water that humans swim in. So to finish off, because I know we have 10 minutes left, right?
Yep.
And people are probably just dying to ask questions, all three of you. So I could have gone and written about other things, but I chose to stick with Mormonism. And there's a reason for that. One of them is Michael Austin, the young Michael Austin, coming to UVSC and giving this really interesting speech. And I don't know if he's published it, but he talked about how he had been reading ethnic literature and loving the strong culture that the writers had to work with, the way they could push back against it, the way they could work with it, the way that it gave them such unique meaning. And he was saying, I wish that I had a culture like that too, so I could write stuff like that. And then I realized, oh, wait, I'm a Mormon. So then it really clicked into place for me when I was taking a graduate level anthropology class. And I saw all these fascinating, mostly indigenous cultures, and not once did I think, is this the true culture?
Mhm.
That didn't matter to anthropology. What mattered was that it was a culture, and people were living in it and making meaning from it. And I thought, oh, I'm living in a culture too. It says it's the true culture, but most of the indigenous cultures that I've been reading about say that too. That's just what cultures say. So after that, for me, Mormonism didn't have to be true to be valid anymore.
Mhm.
And when I looked at the fruit of Mormon culture, I saw that it was complex, changing, odd, and quite beautiful in some places, just like every other culture that I'd been reading about. And I also realized that people had been working hard to make that beauty.
Mhm.
And I thought, hey, I know Mormon culture. It's part of the way I'm wired. And now I know how to tell stories. And I also know how to tell when a story is telling me. And I also know when I want a story to tell me. And I want to create some beauty. And this seems to be the perfect place to do it. So the interesting thing is, as some people know, I split my Sundays between the LDS Church and the Unitarians. And I can really see the difference in my ability to create between the two. I love the Unitarians. They are kind to the marrow. Just being with them, like through sheer osmosis, I become a better person. But I've only been with them for 5 years, and they aren't part of my childhood. I haven't sacrificed for them the way I've sacrificed for the LDS Church. So their stories, don't sneak into my dreams. So I don't have nearly as much material to work with there. So becoming a Unitarian writer, the way I'm a Mormon writer, would require things that I just don't have. And I've realized the more I work with Mormon material, the more material I have to work with. It's a well that just is constantly overflowing. Now, note that I'm not saying that I'm constantly inspired by it. It's more that I'm constantly compelled
Mhm.
to stay in the tension. I'm compelled to stay in the tension because there is so much tension in Mormonism, which means that there is so much room to catch a glimpse of the Aurora.
Oh, I love that image. I want to make sure that in the time we have left that we talk a little bit about especially your most recent project. So the biography that you have just completed on Virginia Sorensen. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that project ties in with your interest in all things Mormon?
Yes, here it is, my biography of Virginia Sorensen, which was, to tell you the absolute truth, the highlight of my writing life. Because in a lot of ways, she was a pioneer for this kind of literature. She lived in two worlds. She grew up in Manti, and she went to the Mormon church. She was a Mormon. She loved church, but her mom was a Christian Scientist, and her dad was a Jack Mormon. So she lived in these two different worlds. And then when she went out and started writing her novels, she was able to inhabit that place. She called it the in-between place, where she was able to, it's extraordinary. When you read her novels, the Orthodox Mormon and the post-Mormon will both feel utterly seen. She knows their souls and she can put them on paper, and it's gorgeous. I really can't recommend Virginia Sorensen enough.
So,
her
and which novel of hers, if you were to recommend a novel of hers to our audience, which novel would you recommend?
Well, if it's one that they can get their hands on, I would say read Where Nothing Is Long Ago, because it's on ebook. You can find it on Kindle. And they're telling me that The Evening and the Morning is going to come out soon. The Evening and the Morning is a perfect novel.
Mhm.
It is extraordinary. But if you want something that gets everything about Virginia Sorensen all bundled into one, you should read Many Heavens. But that's only in paper, and it's very hard to find. But yeah, if you've only got a Kindle, read Where Nothing Is Long Ago. It is exquisite.
I admit that I haven't read any of her novels, but after reading your book, that's next on my to-do list is to read one of those novels. And I'm
You
grateful.
are so lucky. It all lies in front of you, Angela.
Oh, I'm excited.
She is
I'm excited.
I actually, this is funny because I consider you a writer in Virginia's tradition. I think you do much the same thing. I think you have kind of the same voice and the same level of empathy that she had. I think you're going to find a companion soul.
I'm excited. I've read some shorter things, but none of her novels. So what about your next project? What are you working on now?
I am working on a biography of Mae Swenson, which is
Oh,
kind of
that makes
daunting because she I don't know a lot about poetry, and I'm learning lots of poetry now. But she's the next one up.
That's great. Well, I know we just have a couple of minutes left. Can I just ask you, you've been involved in the Mormon literary community for a couple of decades. What are some of the positive changes you see, or what are some of the things that you wish would change more quickly? Any thoughts on that?
So the church is becoming truly worldwide. And I think that means that Mormon literature, I know that means that Mormon literature is going to become truly worldwide as well. And what I really think that means is that it will look totally different than it looks now. You know, the people who are kind of part of the AML here today, we were raised on the stories of early Mormons, the pioneers, the Intermountain West. But I think that very soon that's going to be a niche within a niche of Mormon literature. People will read it as a curiosity because the church is drifting away from our American past and making room for people in different countries and cultures to create their own stories around Mormonism. And I think we're going to kind of be left in the dust as a probably extraordinary and very diverse new visions come to pass. It's going to explode, and it will be really interesting to watch. I'm watching. And I'll edit it for you if you need.
Yes, you will. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. I know we have about a minute left. William, I see that you're back with us. And Andrew, is there anything else that we should ask before we jump off? Okay, well, Stephen, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you, and congratulations on this highly deserved award.
Thanks. I really need to say how much it means to me. I just said it. It means a lot to me. It actually means an extraordinary amount to me, because you work and I felt like I've been in this dark hole pushing things out, and apparently I was doing okay. Thank you. It means a lot to me. I had no idea.
Stephen, I really appreciate the work you do in the background. You're editing for my signature book that's coming out soon. Do you do a lot of editing for them?
I've kind of started a side hustle where I edit for people who are doing their own books. So yeah, I'm still editing books. But yeah, I did a lot of work for Signature too, including editing your very interesting collection of short stories. People are going to take notice when those come out.
Thank you.